live.
We're live. We're live on Facebook.
Hi, everybody.
Hi.
Say hi.
Hi to Facebook.
We'll get started at 7:30.
And that's where all these that you see. Oh, and then you cross. You were able to get and at the bottom is all right. That's what I thought. But also,
Hey, is your phone? Okay.
I was trying to get us.
oh yeah, 4 feet.
I won't look at it.
Yeah.
She's got me such a good
That's awesome.
No, they didn't do it first. But they did 16.
Right. If I set it up right.
Good evening, everyone.
Oh my.
So if I set the front and fall down. See how it's moving?
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Audubon Speaker Series. Hope you all had a good summer and stayed dry. I'm Tim White. I am honored to be the new president of the Audubon Society, taking over this year. Thank you all for coming. I appreciate your support, and I know you're not here for me, you're here for Jim, so I'll go through the announcements pretty quick. Just to give you a little update on how Houston Audubon fared during Harvey times. We took a pretty good hit on our urban sanctuaries. We had some trees down, some trails washed out, lost a couple of bridges. Sims Bayou took some hits and a lot of debris on it, but nothing that can't be fixed and that will be fixed over time. Boy Scout Woods took a little bit of a hit out there, and they got a little water. The biggest problem they have is the water out there isn't safe to drink. The bathrooms aren't working. So if you're heading over to High Island, bring your own water with you if you would, please. Along those lines, Saturday the 23rd, we will be having a site-wide organizational cleanup of our sites. We'll have volunteers at Edith L. Moore helping out there, getting that place recovered. Volunteers over at Sims. We'll have Bolivar Flats. We'll have a beach cleanup that day. So there's a lot going on. Please go to the website and sign up for one of them. We appreciate your help. There's lots to be picked up and lots to be moved around. So we'd really like to see if we can get a bunch of people involved. Thank you for that in advance. We're starting our speaker runs, resuming now. We've got some other things coming up. We have on the 23rd also, instead of volunteering, if you want to go bird watching, we have the Hawk Watch over at Smith Point. Much rather have you go and do some volunteering cleanup and still look up at the Hawks then if you would. We have a Swift Night Out party tomorrow night. Marianne, I don't know where this was over in, where's the Swifts tomorrow night?
Spring Branch.
Spring Branch.
Behind the Home Depot at Beltway and behind the Home Depot at Beltway and I-10. We had 746 yesterday. Wow. Right behind the Home Depot at Beltway 8 and I-10 on the west side, about 2.3 miles from Edith L. Moore. It's an awesome site. There's a pond. The swifts dip down and you're above the pond, so they fly right over your head and the bats come out, and it's a really special property. So Sky High Sports is a trampoline exercise fun place, so you can go jump and then come watch the Swifts.
Go jump, okay? Anyway, we'll have our monthly sanctuary work days as usual, starting up again. The photographic, the Houston Area Natural Photography Association will be doing their third Wednesdays of the month meetings again, and we'll start launching fall bird classes here very shortly. And then the other big one everybody should be aware of is come October, we have our gala. And this year, the theme is Destination High Island, and we're focusing on coastal sanctuaries, and we hope you all attend. And then the last note we have is our major development is that Houston Audubon did get our certification as an accredited land trust this summer. So we made the big time. And Mary Carter, where is Mary? Somewhere in here. Mary, wave your hand, stand up. It's all because of her hard work. She was the one that did the lion's share. Her and Joy Hensky. So that's all I have for notes. We have a raffle to draw. Let me get some. The gala is October the 19th. Thank you. I was going to say 16th. You can go to 16th early.
Thursday
But
night?
Thursday night, the 19th.
You want someone else to draw?
Yeah, have somebody else draw. Tonight we are raffling off a Portraits of Houston, the Kathy Adams Clark and Gary Clark autographed edition of this. And the winning ticket number is 734386. 734386.
2 tickets left. 7,
386.
3, 4.
We get a Sharpie. We can make it work. Nobody? Somebody must have picked it. We didn't make these numbers up.
I got 736.
Ah, close. 386. All right, going once.
We have 2 tickets with the same number.
Oh no!
Uh-oh. I think the chances of you winning are pretty slim.
This one's and they skip 7, they skip 6 and have 2 7s.
Oh, so they come back.
Oh, see if there's another 86 in there. I'm kidding.
The 7, we don't know.
Okay, well, we'll try this again then. All right. Let's pick another one. Pick the other side of this one, you win.
Oh, that's good.
Okay, let's try. 734416.
All right!
Somebody's got bingo. There we go. Okay. Excuse me. There you go. Back down. All right. Now, on to the important stuff. Tonight we have Mr. Jim Blackburn, who is a professor in the practice of environmental law in the Civil and Environmental Engineering Department at Rice University. He is co-director of the Severe Storm Prediction, Education, and Evacuation from Disaster Center, better known as SPEED. He is also an environmental lawyer with the firm of Blackburn and Carter and the owner of Sustainable Planning and Design, a planning firm. Jim has a new book that will be coming out next week, I believe.
That's what I'm hoping.
Yeah, called A Texan Plan for the Texas Coast. He has written 2 other books, The Book of Texas Bays and Birds, a book of verse and vision. Jim has received numerous awards throughout his career, the Barbara C. Jordan Community Advocate Award from the Texas Southern University. Honoring Jim for his unwavering commitment to protecting our environment and the health of Texas throughout the Gulf Coast region. Jim is a valued friend of Houston Audubon and a member of the advisory board. He is on the forefront of policy-related response to Hurricane Harvey and the flooding in our region. He is also pleased that he is here tonight to share more of his recent work. Actually, if anybody's been watching CNN, the news, even Beijing had him on talking about the flooding there. So this guy gets around pretty good. Everybody, Jim Blackburn.
Let's see, did I manage to turn the microphone on? Can you all hear me? Yes. Good. I'm also very proud of Mary Carter, my law partner for many, many years. So thank you for all the good work, Carter. Tonight I want to present Albert Einstein to you. This is the only thing he did that I think I actually understand. And it's a statement he made that I just have found to be absolutely profound. And it's the world we've created to date as a result of our thinking thus far has problems that cannot be solved by thinking the way we were thinking when we created them. I don't think anything describes Harvey and the experiences we've had with Harvey and Allison before that better than this phrase does. But I would tell you it's a more general statement about the situation that humans find themselves in these days. And I think it's going to take all of our creative abilities to be able to move forward. And before I go, I just want to thank you all after Harvey for coming out tonight and kind of getting out and about. And thank you for coming. And we'll see what we can do. I'm kind of curious. How many of you know much about climate change? Have actually read any of the United Nations reports or any of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change reports or anything, but a few of you have. It's not something we've talked a lot about in Houston. I've been known to shut down polite conversations on many occasions, and climate change is one of those subjects that I can just shut down a lot of conversations with. So, kind of with that in mind, let me just get started. Climate change. It's not just about the future, it's about now. Climate change. The Earth's climate is changing. Humans are causing this change. And we really better start paying attention and talking about it. And the sooner is better, because every moment that we delay is causing us valuable time in many different ways. Now, there's Texas code. How many of you know Texas code for climate change? Say weird weather collectively. How many of you have heard weird weather discussed? In Austin, state employees are afraid to talk about climate change because they're afraid they're going to lose their jobs. They're literally concerned. I couldn't raise climate change in any of the cases that we were involved in that might have involved climate change because, frankly, it was just ruled inadmissible. Period. We're not allowed to talk about this issue officially in Texas. So, Texas code for climate change, you hear a lot of people talking about weird weather. That's Texas code for climate change, so just keep that in mind. And just think now, we live in a place and at a time where there's a bona fide, well-adopted scientific theory that we cannot discuss in governmental circles in Texas. Now that is a real somber note to start on. These are findings from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the international body that was basically set up in the late 80s, early 90s. Most everything I'm going to present, I am not an atmospheric scientist. Ron Sass, who is my dear friend, is also my mentor in climate change, and he has schooled me on climate change. What I'm going to be doing is presenting reports of others. This is not my original work, and it is work that I have put together and that I use in my sustainable design course at Rice. Finding, AR5, finding number 1. This is the 5th annual report that they've made. There's a new one supposed to be coming out soon. But look, the language here is very carefully chosen. It's an incredibly difficult body to get consensus among. And they have come up with the conclusion that warming of the climate system is unequivocal. That is the strongest possible word they could have used. It's beyond debate. The climate is changing. The atmosphere and ocean have warmed, the amounts of snow and ice have diminished, sea level has risen, and the concentrations of greenhouse gases have increased. That's not future tense, that's past tense, as of 2013. It has happened, it is happening, and it will continue to happen. Finding number 11. The evidence for human influence has grown since the last report. It is extremely likely that human influence has been the dominant cause of observed warming since the mid-20th century. That is greater than 90% probability of a correct statement, probably in the 95% range. It is more than adequate for virtually any published scientific paper. It's more than is necessary to get evidence into court. The evidence for climate change is much easier to actually get in a courtroom if you've got a judge that would listen under rules of evidence than the case to the contrary, which frankly cannot be supported as evidence in a court of law. Now, why do I say that? Consensus. These are the organizations that have basically endorsed the 2 findings I just reported. American Chemical Society, American Geophysical Union, American Meteorological Society, the American Association of Advancement of Science, Geological Society of America, American Physical Society, and 80 countries' national academies, including the United States, have all adopted the findings. One, the climate is changing, and two, humans are causing it. It's really beyond debate. There's no issue that you will ever encounter that's like climate change. Climate change impacts in all directions. It is a national security issue because of the migration that will be caused by climate change. It will alter stratospheric ozone. It alters air quality at the tropospheric level. It causes desertification. It will influence water in all types of ways, both droughts and floods. It will influence forestry. It will have a tremendous impact on biodiversity. I have spent my whole career in environmental issues. I have never run across an issue that has as pervasive impacts across so many different vectors as does climate change. Now, a lot of what I'm going to be talking about are projections. And if there are uncertainties, it is in these projections, because there will be models that are used in association with the projections. The projections have to do with the fact that we have to anticipate how many tons of greenhouse gases will be emitted. You have higher estimates, you have some mid-range estimates, and you have some lower future estimates. There's all sorts of variations on these, but the point is there's a projection into the future of what these emissions will look like, and then there are models that predict change based upon it. The most convincing diagram that I've ever seen was one that basically shows if you try to explain all of these changes with just natural functions in modeling, it doesn't get there. You add natural functions with human-caused intervention, and you get there. And that's true virtually across the board. I will be talking tonight about projections as well as existing data. I'll try to be clear when I'm making the difference. There's two things that I'll be talking about. I'll be talking about tons of carbon dioxide emissions and tons of carbon emissions. Some charts use one number, some use the other. To go from carbon to carbon dioxide, you have to multiply by 3.6. So 1 ton of carbon emission is 3.7 tons of carbon dioxide emissions. The tons of carbon dioxide emissions are always going to be greater than the tons of carbon, but they're used interchangeably. It is easy to get mixed up. The other thing I'll be doing is talking, some of the graphs are going to be in degrees Fahrenheit, some are going to be in degrees centigrade. I'll try to keep straight about which ones are which. It does get confusing. This is data. This is climate change. This is from 1971 to 2000, average projected out to 2050. Models to 2050 based on the average taken away from 71 to 2000. The increase that you're going to be seeing is going to be huge up at the poles, where you're talking about in terms of degrees Fahrenheit, upwards of 20 degrees Fahrenheit by 2050. And it gradates back from that. Your future scenarios in terms of high emissions and low emissions vary tremendously. The future with the low emissions would show, this is in degrees centigrade, an increase on average about 1 to 2 degrees centigrade, with again at the poles seeing the higher level. This is under a low emission scenario of the future. With a high emission scenario of the future, this model came out by 2100 with about 9, 10, 11 degrees centigrade difference, about 20 degrees Fahrenheit. Texas. Right now on Texas coast, we have about 20 days, maybe on average, that hit 100 degrees. Maybe not quite that much. 2080 to 2090, with the low emission scenario, we'll have maybe 20 to 30 days. High emission scenario, we'll have 100 to 120 days a year over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. That's a lot of hot days. How many of you get tired of the number of hot days we have right now? It's only going to be increasing. Now, John Nielsen Gammon is the Texas State climatologist who has one of the hardest jobs in probably the world. Is talking about climate change in Texas. This is his projection. These are his observations, and up as of about 2000, he basically has come up with about 1 to 2 degree Fahrenheit change. The higher emission scenarios may get you up to 12 degrees Fahrenheit by 2100. Lower emissions, maybe as low as 2 degrees Fahrenheit, but with on average kind of in between the two being 4 to 6 degrees Fahrenheit. You'll hear some more that John Nielsen has to say. But basically, he says that climate change is largely anthropogenic, human-caused, and should be expected to continue. So he is in accord with climate scientists all over the world. And he's still employed. So. Now, some of what I'm going to talk about is what's projected to happen in the future. These are the heat-related deaths. Very, very rough graphic, but just simply indicating the heat-related deaths will increase across the board. Malaria be expected to expand. Tropical diseases will expand north and south from the equatorial zones. That's the area where possible extended distribution by 2050. That includes much of the Texas coast, much of the Gulf Coast. Dengue fever has already arrived. It's expected to expand further. So we'll have a higher incidence of tropical disease. Wildfires. Acres of wildfires. West Texas is squarely in the middle of this, but every place just about except for where you see blue would have at least 1 to 10,000 acres burned. Water supplies will be declining. We're talking about, in the case of, with a low and no climate change effects taken into account, we're going to have water problems anyway. I think right now Texas has a stack of water plans that go probably from here to the ceiling. They do not include climate change. All of our water projections do not include climate change right now. With climate change effects, it's expected that we will have a much higher incidence of extreme water risk. I think that'd be important to know. I mean, part of what I'm most concerned about is not necessarily what these effects are, but that we're not thinking about them. We're not planning for them. We're not anticipating them. Because right now it doesn't seem like we're going to do anything about it, and I actually think that will change. And in fact, I'm not going to talk to you just about the horror. I am going to offer some hope at the end as well. But we need to know these things. If this is the future we're facing, and if we're not going to do anything about it, we need to know what we're dealing with. Right now, we're basically closing our eyes, closing our ears, closing our brains to this issue. That's intolerable going forward. Change in water demand with and without climate change. We're going to see more water needed because of population changes, things like that. With climate change, the percent increase in water demand will be significant on top of the change that would be coming anyway. John Nielsen Gammon. Most projections show most of the United States having less precipitation in the future, but the models are very different on this, and it's not real clear. John Nielsen Gammon. Overall, rainfall has increased by about 5 to 8% over the past century, except for West Texas, which has seen little change. So we've been up on rainfall. Climate projections from models are inconsistent and tend to favor a decrease. So the future for Texas precipitation is unclear. Although I will say Ron Sass looked at the models and his conclusion was that the model's consensus was that there would be a decline in rainfall, runoff, and surface water availability into the future. Ron did this work for me on the Guadalupe Basin when we were involved in the whooping crane litigation to try to figure out in the future what does inflows into San Antonio Bay, and whooping cranes eat crabs and they need freshwater inflow. And In the future, on top of all of the demands, which mean already the Guadalupe is over-allocated, we will have, according to Ron, about 15% less inland precipitation, and runoff will decrease by about 7.5%, upwards in 2500 to 2050 to 2100 time period. He sees about 200,000 acre-feet less of water being available, and it's a bay that needs every drop that it can get. Agriculture, there'll be winters. The green is positive. If you're in the green area, it's a positive. If you're red, it's not positive. Agricultural yields will decline in the red. Extreme daily rainfall. John Nielsen Gammon, again, Texas State climatologist. Our frequency of extreme daily rainfall has increased by about 20% over the past century. Extreme rainfall is more robustly connected to global climate change than is total rainfall. And that trend should be expected to continue. This is a damage curve associated with severe natural events. Geophysical is at the bottom, the red. That's kind of even. One, geophysical isn't linked to climate change, but it sort of equalizes across population growth and other variables. And it's kind of stayed steady. Hydrologic, meteorological, and geophysical, meteorological, hydrological, and climatological have all increased. And the net curve is increasing severity and increasing occurrence of severe weather events. Now, this is a bell curve. In terms of distribution, your normal events occur in the middle. That's the top of the bell curve. At the edges are the rarer events, the ones that are less common. I once saw a presentation, and the presenter was talking about stocks, and he was talking about the bell curve on stocks. And he drew a line here, and he drew a line here, and basically said, now this area over here, and this area over here, and he labeled it TBD. Well, to be determined, that doesn't make sense. His assessment was there be dragons. There are dragons at the edge of the bell curve. That's where the rare events occur. And what you see here at the top is Moscow temperatures since 1950. And you've had some extreme highs occurring, 72, 2001, and then 2010. And you're basically at the third deviation off of the norm. So you're starting to talk about very low probability events becoming more frequent. Those are the climate dragons. And we just had one in Harvey. Severe weather. Now, if you wanted to describe climate change related storms, what would you say? You would say the results were off the charts. This is Harris County Flood Control District's study of Tropical Storm Allison. Allison was off the charts. By the way, Flood Control District, both Mike Talbot and I think it's Chris Poppy, the new director, both disavow climate change has anything to do with our storms. Now, off the charts describes just what I was talking about with that bell distribution and with the edges. Allison, we had 74,000 homes that were damaged. We had upwards of, the small area had 35 inches of rain. You know, the county as a whole maybe averaged 20 inches of rain. We had July 2012 rainfall event. And in the darkest red, that is from a 100-year to a 500-year storm event. Tax day flood. Look up at Pattison. We had a 10,000-year event in Pattison and Waller County. We had a 2,000-year event. We had a 2,500-year event. We had a 1,000-year, 900, 900, at different rain gauges. These are rare events. And they keep occurring. And then we get to Harvey. I've skipped a couple. By the way, how many of you have chuckled when you've heard that we just had a 100-year storm? How many of you think that that 100-year storm, you know, the concept, the word, when you're told that, how many of you think it has ceased to have meaning to you? I would tell you, when common sense and science come together, you may really have something. And I think our instincts is that something's weird's going on. The science tells us that, and yet we deny it. That is a map of rainfall distribution. The darkest red is 50.4 inches over 5 days. Low is 5.4. 35 inches average across Harris County. Some areas more, few areas less, but everywhere had at least 20 inches on average. Now that is extremely high rainfall. That was really over a 4-day time period. A little bit came on the 5th day, but for the most part that was in 4 days. Now these are our 100-year events. And by the way, we have a 100-year event for 5 minutes all the way to 4 days. Look at our 500-year event in inches for 4 days. 21 inches. We basically doubled the 500-year storm by these statistics. I would tell you that chart's worthless. But that's what we use for our planning purposes. Every engineering solution is built to this chart. Every elevation of a house, every floodplain map is based on this chart. Every hazardous waste site is protected to the levels shown in this chart, and mainly it's the 24-hour 100-year, which is 13 inches in 24 hours. That has been readily exceeded. I would tell you that the 100-year, we're trying to figure it out over at Speed Center, what the 100-year actual rainfall probably should be. I think it's at least 19 inches, which is the current 500-year storm. I talked to a hydrologist yesterday. He thought it was 30 inches. Those are huge numbers. But the question is, what do we plan for the future? I have not run across a single engineer or scientist that can give me a number I have faith in. Now, I think we'll come up with it. But the point being, we cannot just rely on what we've been depending on in the past. Harvey, 190 billion was projected, the last I heard. That was AccuWeather, so that could be wrong. But it's a big number. It's going to be the biggest number, I think, for any storm event ever in United States history. At least 75,000 homes have been flooded or damaged to some extent. I have heard estimates as high as 150,000. I may have even been the source of one of those estimates. 10 to 20,000 are likely to be uninhabitable and have to be either totally redone or perhaps removed. And hundreds of thousands of cars have been destroyed. So was Harvey related to climate change? Well, hurricanes, tropical storms are heat pumps. They thrive off the heat of the ocean. And the Gulf of Mexico is one of the hottest bodies of waters in the world. The area where Harvey formed, once it came back over the Yucatan Peninsula and got into the Bay of Campeche and started moving into the Gulf, was 2 degrees to 7 degrees above the average for the Gulf of Mexico for this time of year. And it just stripped all of that heat right on out. And it went virtually overnight from a tropical cyclone to a Category 4 storm. Classic climate change, basically science. Something called the Power Dissipation Index. This is really an index of basically how much power is available for a hurricane. It's related to the heat of the oceans and the ability to uptake that heat. And you don't want that chart to go up, but it's going up. That basically portends that in the future it's going to get worse and worse and worse with these tropical systems and hurricanes. You know, with Irma, I heard them projecting, they never did it, but they were talking about they may have to develop a Category 6 because Irma was at the top of Category 5. Doesn't exist on the charts right now. We don't have a Category 6, but they were saying we might need to create one for Irma. That's severe weather events. This is our model of what a future sea level rise influence, what we think is a fairly reasonable storm to see. That's purple is 30 feet up the Houston Ship Channel. Everything on the ship channel is protected to about 15 feet. Think about everything on the ship channel up to 15 feet deep. Right now, we think it's perfectly reasonable to think a 25-foot surge would come up the ship channel. That will cause 90 million gallons of oil and hazardous substance to spill, according to Jamie Paget at Rice. That is 9 times bigger than the Exxon Valdez and about half the size of Deepwater Horizon, all coming into Galveston Bay, perhaps into the neighborhoods to begin with. It will be the worst environmental disaster in United States history. This will be worse. That's in our future if we don't start thinking about doing so. Sea level rise. The areas in red are the most vulnerable. Our coast is included among those areas. Country-wise, China is by far and away the most vulnerable. This is population that is by total 2010 population below median locked-in sea level rise based on different warming scenarios. High scenario, 145 million people in China are going to be in trouble. United States, about 25 million. Sea level rise, the projection, 1 to 4 feet was sort of the standard understanding. It's now been, I think, moved up to 6 feet. James Hansen from NASA, who is probably the best of the, and most outspoken, and perhaps most outrageous of the climate scientists, is projecting 10 feet of sea level rise. That's the Texas coast. This is an image from the new book I've got coming out, which, by the way, does have a chapter in climate change. The book has not been banned yet in Texas. 0 to 3, with 3 feet of sea level rise, everything in red will be underwater. With 3 to 6 feet of sea level rise, you pick up the orange, which really gets you up in Chambers County, Jefferson County, Brazoria, Matagorda. 6 to 10, you're talking about a significant portion of the coast. We're going to begin to see this. Now, this is a chart that kind of threw me when I first saw it, because these are the days when you're going to have nuisance flooding. Number of days with higher high tides that begin to come over roads and into your infrastructure. And this is South Padre Island. And if you notice the orange down here in the bottom, those are the things that have already happened. That's past. Those are events that occur. And I was looking at that chart, and here all, a whole bunch of us thinking we're real smart looking at this chart. And, well, why did that chart level off over there about 2060? And from there, 2100 is flat. Trying to figure that out. So that's all the days in a year. A bunch of smart people looking at you going, 365 days a year you'll have nuisance flooding on South Padre Island. This is a chart. Yeah, it is moving. This Nature Conservancy did this. This is a chart about what we think might happen or perhaps should happen with regard to marshes. Because as sea level rises, we're going to start suffocating and losing our marshes. And so there's going to be a need for our marshes to move. So one of the progressive thoughts is maybe we can help that happen somehow. Maybe we can basically work with landowners and begin to move that forward and be able to plan for that happening. Birds. This is off the Audubon website. Oh, careful over there. You okay? Good. This is basically the nesting range. I think that's Baltimore Oral, if I remember correctly. These are just basically the change in where species spend the winter and the fact that it's moving further north all the time. We're seeing biological responses to climate change. They are happening and will happen into the future. I think one of the worries is if the migration gets off kilter from when the food supply is available and whether you're going to have sufficient of food for when the birds come through and the way that they've always come through. And so you're going to see changes like this occurring. A recent article in the Houston Chronicle said that they've been basically seining for flounder for decades in the Texas bays. And they're still finding a lot of big flounder, but they're not finding many juveniles flounder. Because flounder need a certain temperature below which their eggs and below which either the biological impulse to spawn or the eggs mature. And our temperatures have been rising in the water. And they're concerned that the flounder may actually not be reproducing anymore. And that we're going to lose our flounder stock on the Texas coast. Now there's other species that may be moving in. But we're beginning to see biological changes. Coral bleaching is one of the kind of notorious aspects about changing temperature of the oceans. The fact that we're going to be seeing more and more, that's a change from 1998 to 2006. Wish I had more up-to-date information. Seawater pH. I heard Paul Montagna from the Heart Research Institute talking at a conference. I asked him to come be the keynote speaker for it, and he was talking about pH changes. And one of the changes with global climate change, the pH of the oceans are going up. And that makes it more difficult to basically fix the calcium carbonate in the shells of crabs and in oysters. And that so far he thinks it's a bigger impact on oysters than on crabs, but he thinks both are a problem. And these are future scenarios about what the pH may be looking at as we move from really more basic toward more and more acidic ocean water. So what do people think about all of this? Well, Yale's done some surveys. You'll be happy to know that at least it looks like over 50% of most people think global warming is occurring. Basically, that orange is right about the middle. I mean, the yellow is right about the middle. The red is a higher percentage that think global warming, and anything in blue would be a lower, but there's not much blue on that map. That's as of 2016. Global warming is happening? Yes, 70%. Global warming is caused by humans, 53%. Most scientists think global warming is happening. That's a very interesting finding here. Most people that were surveyed think science do not think that global warming is happening. Virtually every scientist I know is in the camp that climate is changing and humans are changing it. So where did that come from? I would tell you that's media coverage. Trust climate scientists about global warming? Yeah, we trust them, but we just don't think they think climate change is occurring. Are you worried about climate change? Oh, 58%, yes. Global warming is already harming people in the United States, or now within 10 years, 51%. Global warming will harm me personally. This is a fascinating one, 40%. It's happening. It's going to hurt people, but not me. Global warming will harm people in the United States, 58%, but just not me. Global warming will harm people in developing countries, 63%, certainly not me. Global warming will harm future generations, 70%, really not me. And global warming will hurt plants and animals, 69%. So, you've heard the horror. There is hope. But the hope is going to be about trying to figure out how to do something progressive about this. Now, when I say progressive, so much of what I've heard about climate change from the environmental community stops where I am right now. And basically perhaps goes to renewables. But there is a whole suite of things that can be done. And some of the things are really appropriate for Houston. And I want to try to finish tonight by talking about one of these concepts that I think really has potential for the future of Houston and frankly for the future of many of the red states, which are going to be the most difficult. I mean, one of the reasons I wrote the book of A Texan Plan for the Texas Coast is if we can figure out something that works in Texas, it'll work anywhere in the world. Because this is about the hardest nut there is to crack. And I have to tell you, I've been beating my head in the wall for about 40 years, so I can attest to how hard the nut is. But everything from the Paris Accords to Pope Francis, there's pressure coming. I'm sorry, I went the wrong direction. The oil companies are having pressure from all sorts of directions. And this is, I think, something that's largely gone below the radar. You've got moral opposition to use of fossil fuels, most notably Pope Francis. Legal opposition, what the states of New York and Massachusetts are doing, is something to keep your eye on, because it really has to do with stockholder fraud and manipulation of information. That has to do with the fact that there are different messages internally within the oil companies, which I'll talk about in a minute, and what they have put externally on the filings with the 10Ks and the stock exchange. Consumer movement, I think, is going to be huge. The movement to carbon neutrality, I think, will become the biggest movement of the kind of the early 21st century. And financial decision making is getting to be more and more attuned to climate change. The University of California system just made a decision not to invest further in oil and gas related investments, not because of moral opposition to climate change, but because they think it was a bad investment. Because they think long term there's going to be a lot of stranded assets in the oil and gas industry. Pledges to become carbon neutral. This is an older image. Nike's on this one. Yakima. Monsanto just pledged to be carbon neutral. Google, Microsoft. You're starting to see a lot of corporations begin to line up from a strategic marketing standpoint to position themselves as being carbon neutral. That means you've either switched to renewables, you have, through efficiency, reduced your carbon footprint, and then if those two things don't get you to zero, that you arrange to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And that's really where I'm going with this. But I want to cover a few other things. These are the cities of the world that right now have pledged to be carbon neutral. Vancouver, Seattle, Portland, San Francisco, Boulder, Minneapolis, Toronto, Boston, New York, Washington, D.C., Rio, London, Oslo, Stockholm, Copenhagen, Berlin, Yokohama, Adelaide, Sydney, and Melbourne are the carbon neutral pledge cities now. You're going to start seeing more and more cities pledging to be carbon neutral. Rice University, among 600 other universities, is pledged to be carbon neutral in the future. The Living Building Challenge requires carbon neutral. Leeds is moving toward carbon neutrality. You're beginning to, there's an engineering certification called Envision, where carbon neutral is a part of the design criteria. This is the most brilliant piece of work I've ever read. Just about 2 Princeton professors wrote something that's amazingly simple, but this is how you get a grasp on doing something about climate change. We're talking about billions of tons of carbon dioxide, and in this case, these are carbon emissions. And we were, at the time they wrote this in 2004, and this is Pakala and Sokolow doing this, they were basically saying we're at about 8 billion tons of carbon emissions. Multiplied by 3.6 for carbon dioxide, it's up around 30 billion tons of carbon dioxide. And we're headed towards 16, and we can't do that. So how do we get a grip on that? And they talked about bite-sized portions of 1 billion tons of carbon each. And conceptually, to me, it was a breakthrough concept, because all of a sudden there was a manageable approach to thinking about this much carbon and carbon dioxide. Avoidance, they think you can pick up maybe 4 gigatons through renewables, maybe a gigaton with nukes, if anybody has a stomach for nukes. Minimization, energy efficiency and conservation, you might be able to pick up 4 billion tons of carbon. Switching from coal to natural gas, you could maybe pick up another 1 billion tons. But the only thing left after you've avoided and minimized, the only thing left is to remove it through some form of mitigation. The only mitigation is carbon capture and storage, and look at that, ecosystems. Forest, prairies, wetlands, putting carbon into the soil, terrestrial sequestration of carbon. Turns out carbon capture and storage so far is exorbitantly expensive and does not come close to the scale that's needed. The only proven method, the only technology for removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere is nature, is nature's processes. And I think this is where everything's going to be headed, is going to be to tie the human economy into nature's economy and to tie us into natural cycles. Now with this slide, I can talk to anybody in Houston about ecology. I have talked to people in Houston about my spiritual connection to the environment. I can put a lot of businessmen and women in downtown Houston asleep with that conversation. Now, Audubon, that's a good conversation to have. In the business community, it's a tough one. Ethical obligation, tough conversation. Talk money? Now, many of my environmental friends go, money, environment, how can we mix those things? That's sacred ground you're talking about money with. Yeah. But it may be the only conversation that will actually transform this discussion into something moving forward. At Rice, we're developing something called the Texas Coastal Exchange to facilitate buying and selling ecological services. We're looking at marshlands, not only for carbon sequestration, but for the fish and wildlife values that marshes have, also for wave reduction to landowners. With prairies, we think there's carbon sequestration. We think we can enhance water supply, and we think we can knock the top off of floods. We can knock the peak by maybe 10%, maybe 15% on a river like the Brazos River if we restored the native prairie up the Brazos River watershed, up the Guadalupe, up the Colorado. If we save the Katy Prairie, we would make a dent in the long-term future of Houston, because there's flood storage capacity there, but we just never paid for it. We've never thought about a landowner actually having something of value to the community because their land took water in. Instead, we've said, thank you, if we've said that. There's fish and wildlife value, and you can raise cattle. With forest, you can get carbon, you can get enhanced water supply, you can get fish and wildlife, and of course you can sell wood. I think one of the emerging architectural trends is to use more wood in construction, because that's carbon sequestration for perhaps another 50 to 80 years, and you can go replant your forest and continue. So all of a sudden, a lot of thinking about how to sequester carbon. I would tell you it will be the dominant concept in architecture in the future and in engineering. And oyster reefs have a lot to offer as well. Now this is a complicated diagram, but it's basically how we think we can set up transactions to buy and sell carbon dioxide rights in Texas. And we have a lot of faith that we can actually set this system up. Our goal is to go from 1,000 landowners in the 2017 to 2020 period to, and actually this is almost out of date now, we think we'll be at 30,000 landowners by 2025. These are landowners that are going to get paid for putting carbon into the soil and for essentially raising prairies and cropping carbon. Farmers and ranchers becoming carbon farmers is where we're headed in the future. And if we're right, the oil and gas industry will be the primary client. Because if they want to emit into the future, the only way we see it happening is they're going to have to find a way to take out what they're putting up, or what we're putting up. Terrestrial sequestration is an answer. So, what if I told you I could sell you a carbon neutral car? Would you pay extra for a carbon neutral car? How much extra? No carbon footprint, and yet you'll emit carbon. All you need is about 88% of a football field, and that will sequester the carbon dioxide from the average use of an average car for a year. General Motors is looking seriously at this concept right now to basically come back against the electric car. Now, if you hear that this is all about money, it is all about money. Because the electric car is taking a larger and larger share of the market. Tesla is going to have actually a lower cost electric car, I think, that's starting to come out soon. There's a waiting list, what, a couple of years long right now to get that vehicle. What was it? Volvo, I think, announced that they were only going to make hybrids and electric cars, I think, starting, they said, by 2040. Well, this actually may be cleaner than an electric car, because the electric car has to be run on electricity, and all the electricity in renewables. We act like it is. It's an electric car, it's no problem. Not quite true. And so we're going to be basically looking at carbon footprints on everything. And we're going to be looking at balancing that footprint out. Now, $5 a ton of carbon dioxide going into the soil, that would add about $23.50 a year to operate a vehicle carbon neutral. If you were paying $40 a ton, it'd be about $200 a year to be carbon neutral. And maybe at $40 a ton, that's 8 times 40, about 40 cents a gallon. Would you pay 40 cents a gallon more for carbon neutral gasoline? Some people would. How many people does it take to convince an oil company that they need a pump for carbon neutral gasoline? That's going to happen. It's just a question of when. How about carbon neutral oil refining? 150,000 barrel refinery, take care of all of the gas that they make, and it takes 3% of Texas. That's a lot of land. But if you want to use a refinery in the year 2050, you may have to have this. Carbon neutral flying. Same thing. All of the global emissions from aviation take 8% of the United States right now in terms of carbon emissions. Now, all of this is going to be, I would tell you, for the most part, restored prairie, restored marshes, and restored forest. And it will be managed forests. These will be essentially natural systems re-emerging as the dominant ecological system of the United States as a response to the horror that I showed you at an earlier time. And the horror is real, but I think this future is just as real. So the story for the oil industry. Carbon storage capacity. Do you have yours? Sort of like what's in your wallet. We were trying to be catchy. Our illustrator's not quite as good as I would have liked them to be, but they came up with Gumby. I'm not sure what But right now, there's 32 billion tons of carbon dioxide. We think at best there may be 7 to 14 billion tons of capacity if we made a full-scale effort at terrestrial sequestration. Shortfall, 18 billion tons. Those will be the companies that do not succeed. Those will be the buggies. You know, Jake Hershey, Terry Hershey's husband, pulled me aside one day and said, "Blackburn, have you ever thought about the buggy company?" And I had to admit, I'm sitting there, Jake's advised me on business, and I know nothing about business. I'm sitting there going, why is he talking to me about the buggies? And he said, well, you know, have you ever thought much about the horse and buggy? I said, no, Jake, I really hadn't thought about that at all. And he said, well, you know, the car comes along and the buggy's gone. You ever heard anybody lament the loss of the buggies? Now, I mean, come on. Have any of y'all ever heard anybody decry the loss of horse and buggy? But somebody had a whole industry making buggies. And basically within a decade or two, they were out of business. And a whole new industry had spawned. We're on the brink of that happening. And the question is going to be, who's going to have the carbon dioxide storage capacity for the future? This is the business proposition of the 21st century. And we're hoping to set up the trading platform not only for carbon dioxide, but also for water, for flood damage reduction, for biodiversity enhancement, and protected lands management. We're talking to some people that have clients up in the Midwest that have wind farms that have the potential of harming hooping cranes. And this is all perhaps potential high-use hooping crane habitat that's not being used now. Perhaps they could pay to create better hooping crane habitat on the Texas coast and help out the wind farms up in the Midwest that may be subject to endangered species prosecution if they don't get a Section 11 permit. Or how about gifts? How many of you have ever received a worthless gift? I mean, just how many worthless gifts have you ever gotten? And then what if your significant other came in and said, well, honey, I'm going to give you your carbon footprint this year as a present. Or perhaps you give a bird watcher a piece of neotropical migrant coastal woodlot habitat. Or a fisherman helped build a new reef in Galveston Bay. That's a gift market. Some people might get divorced over such gifts. Some may do better. But I think these are the kind of the unlimited horizons if we're just creative. And if we think we've got a problem and we're going to have to fix it. And we're going to have to think differently than we were thinking when we created these problems. And these are just some examples of different thinking. There's a million more out there. But I tell you, it's going to be a really interesting future. It's going to be hotter, but there's going to be hope out there. And, you know, to send you along your way, read this fine book that's getting ready to come out. And this is, I actually got a copy of it. They supposedly have arrived in Los Angeles and are being shipped over to A&M and should be available next week. And this book actually talks about all of these things I've talked about tonight and a bunch more. But thank you for listening to me, and I'll be happy to answer any questions you have. Question on the front row here?
I have a question. Is there a cog in the wheel with your opinions with Al Gore or not?
Well, I think Al Gore and I would agree on the first part of the presentation about the horror. When Al Gore came here into town last summer, a year ago summer, I kind of met with the advance team and tried to talk them into talking about terrestrial sequestration and these concepts. And they really weren't interested in them. You know, they were much more interested in renewables and much more interested in avoidance of hydrocarbons. And there's a lot of people that think that this is helping the oil and gas industry, and they're opposed to it just because philosophically they don't like the oil and gas industry. I think that's a luxury we can't afford. So there may be a difference there, there may not be. But at least when I tried to sell it to them a year and a half ago, they were not interested in at least taking the presentations at their conference in that direction.
Maybe your book will change his mind.
You know, hope springs eternal. Yes.
What role does risk management have to play in this? Meaning, you know, the whole petrochemical infrastructure that is at huge risk of disaster, and the insurance industry and all of those. How are they a part of this conversation?
They're a part of it. Is, you know, it's a very with regard to, say, surge, we've done a lot of work with surge, and industry has been really tight-lipped. And it's very difficult to really broach the subject with the industry itself for several reasons, one of which they're very afraid to publicly say, yeah, we need all sorts of protection, because they're either afraid, one, someone's going to say, well, then why don't you pay for it? And they would rather, frankly, the government pay for it if they can get the government to do it. And secondly, they're very afraid of liability. Because if they admit there's a significant risk, then they might open themselves up to civil litigation and if a bad event occurred. So there's extreme caution there. Now, I would tell you in the latter part where I was talking about the Texas Coastal Exchange, that's risk management of a different type. And basically, for them to participate in this is almost a form of insurance in the future about, there's no disagreement within the oil industry that there is climate change controls coming. It's just a question of when and at what cost. But the internal projections for the cost of carbon, you know, $40 to $60 a ton are common estimates. All future projects within most of the big oil industry have a cost of carbon dioxide emissions associated with it because they're trying to project over the life of a project what they're going to have to spend. And if you don't think in terms of carbon dioxide cost in the future, you probably will misread the financial tea leaves about whether a project's feasible or not. So a lot of this there's a lot of risk elements in here. There's all sorts of different pieces. I've been trying to have a conversation with the secondary insurers. I think there's a conversation to be had there. We have not had it yet. It's from Speed Center back really across to Lloyd's of London and some of the other, the big insurers of the secondary market. Other questions? Way back in the back.
Yes, you spoke about the effects on the bays of reduced rainfall and mentioned your work on the effects of over-dedication of the Guadalupe River on the looping cranes.
Correct.
Can you talk briefly on the effect on the estuary and ecosystems from severe rain events?
Well, severe rain events are at the opposite end of the spectrum, obviously. Most of the attention has been focused on the deprivation of the bays, and we have seen evidence. Nueces Bay was actually killed by the deprivation. We really haven't seen the killing of a bay system from the oversupply or from the huge flood bursts that come in. Generally, hurricanes and other severe weather events have been considered to be positive perturbances. Freshets is sort of a nice way of putting it. A big ass flood is what we're experiencing up here right now. My belief on that is that, first of all, many of the finfish simply swim away. So they'll swim to saltier water and they'll stay in the saltier areas during the interim when the bay becomes overfresh. I think if it's fresh for too long, you can kill certainly the species that are not mobile. I think there's some worry about oyster productivity with too much fresh water. There's concern about shrimp productivity with too much fresh water. But I think on balance that has been considered, at least with the scientists I've talked to, they think it's part of the natural cycles and is a positive thing. So I would tell you it's just considered to be a natural occurrence. And so are droughts. It's just that whether with our droughts, we're making them worse because we're taking water out when it's needed most. With regard to the floods, whether we're putting more water in than they've ever seen before, and it may have detrimental effects in the future. We've not seen that yet, but so far I've not read anything in the science I've seen about that.
Well, it's only been 2 weeks.
Well, and this is on this event, but in past events I haven't seen any long-term changes, for example, in bay species distribution or something like that. Other questions? Yes, up there.
Could you tell us a little bit about the efforts of James Baker along these lines?
Yeah, Secretary Baker over at the Baker Institute is one of a number of major both economic and political figures that have endorsed a carbon tax. Is that what you're talking about, Lloyd?
Yes.
And Secretary Baker has recommended a $40 per ton tax on each ton emitted of carbon dioxide. Under his plan, that money that would be coming in would be basically a tax rebate given to citizens. That part of the plan, I think, is actually not a good part because nothing he's talking about removes carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. His tax is basically a tax on emission. And at $40 a ton, I think, frankly, that's just the cost of emitting carbon. I think there's a lot of places that would choose just to go ahead and emit carbon at $40 a ton. I'd much rather see that $40 tax go to pay farmers to sequester carbon dioxide and use that tax to go back to put carbon into the soil. So that would be where I disagree with it. I think it was a very, very brave thing for Secretary Baker to do, to suggest that he was even supportive of a carbon tax in Houston, which is not a place that generally favors that. So, or at least, not everybody does. Louis?
Is there any legal recourse for these agencies that ignore climate change and their projections?
Well, I think it's going to be some interesting lawsuits coming up about that. Under the National Environmental Policy Act, for example, the federal government has to disclose environmental impacts of big actions. And right now, NEPA is still on the books. The new administration has indicated they're going to rescind a lot of the climate directives that came out of the Obama administration. And one might think that an environmental impact statement might come out that just had nothing about climate change in it under the new administration. And I think that would be attacked legally as being insufficient from a scientific standpoint for an environmental impact statement. So yes, I think you'll see those types of things. Whether there's a different type of lawsuit, whether there's some sort of public trust doctrine concept about climate change, that's a much more creative lawsuit. I think a lot of the judiciary I've run across don't have much of a stomach for creativity. But then again, it depends on how bad the situation gets. I mean, I was in front of Judge Ellison on Addicts and Barker back in 2010. And he was very, very concerned about what he heard about Addicts and Barker at that point in time. So I think with the right judge, you can get a very interesting hearing. Judge Rosenthal here in federal court has done some really interesting things with FEMA mapping and litigation we've been involved in. So the right judge, yeah, you can do some things. With some judges, you can't do it that. Way back in the far corner up there.
Is there an avenue or a way for a rancher now to do what you're talking about with the sequestering of
Well, we're working on setting up a system right now. Lloyd's working with us and a few others. Our approach to this is a little different. We're basically only going to sell carbon that we can prove has actually been sequestered in the soil. So we're going to set up a system that will have ranchers test their soil before they sort of enroll. And you basically establish a carbon content in your soil. And then you can use certain types of cattle ranching techniques that actually can enhance the amount of carbon, although any native prairie will put carbon in the soil. You come back maybe 3 years later and measure, and you can sell the increment of carbon that you have increased by putting it in the soil. That's sort of the concept we're working on. We're trying to gather basically investments from buyers, some oil companies, some airlines, perhaps a chemical company, perhaps other types of companies. And those investors will basically put a pot of money together to pay ranchers to do the initial testing, to try to make it basically almost, I mean, it's not a cost-free, at least a cost-sharing process between the buyers and the sellers for beginning to get this testing underway. And the first transactions we're thinking about through this system won't happen until about 2020, 2021. But it will be underway, we think, the first of next year.
So if you have a ranch, theoretically, how do you get involved in that process? My Rice email address is real easy. You can only have 8 letters and the word Blackburn has 9. So I am blackburr@rice.edu. Email me and we'll sign you up. At least to receive information. No obligation. Question?
Jim, putting this carbon dioxide back in the soil, have they done studies on how that's going to affect the microbes in the soil?
Oh, it's all about soil health. This is all about healthy soil. This is a healthy ecosystem. The plant life with the restored prairies and with these certain types of grazing techniques, actually the native prairie begins to reappear. You don't overgraze it. You graze it in a certain way. You're trying to replicate the buffalo. So you're trying to basically replicate the natural system back before we settled. And as such, you would be restoring the ecology. Now, there's a major set of experiments being done out of Arizona State University right now, and there are kind of companions. We've got a kind of a handshake partnership. And amazingly enough, their major investor is McDonald's. So why would McDonald's be investing in this? Beef. They want grass-fed beef. They want a healthier beef product. They're under the gun for what they're serving. So they get a healthier beef product, but they want to make sure that the ecological system will benefit as well. And so the studies are being done right now at Arizona State that I think will offer the definitive proof, at least the anecdotal evidence, some of the early evidence is absolutely the ecosystem's recovering. You're getting all of your insects, you're getting your bees, you're getting the birds. I mean, this is what Audubon's been working with on the prairie grass systems, except way beyond that. So it's all looking very, very positive right now. Yes?
So when you were talking earlier about how the ranchers or landowners get their land tested and certified, it doesn't sound like there's actually a third party involved in that, other than maybe being sent off to a lab.
Well, you're going to have it tested.
Right.
Most ranchers are not going to be able to actually run the test.
No, I'm just saying, like.
So a third one, that's what I'm saying, a third party would be brought in to do the testing.
The
And-
sampling as well?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
And then you've got a sampling
monitoring?
protocol, and where you're gonna have to do some statistics on what you've sampled, because you've gotta get a 95% confidence that you've actually targeted the soil, because there will be some models used to figure out how you take it across 100 or 1,000 or perhaps 10,000 acres. From 5 samples, 10 samples, 20 samples. I'm learning a lot more about statistics than I ever wanted to know.
Is there a
But
monitoring component though over the years?
over the years, you'll just come back in similar locations and do the same tests again, and then you see if there's an increase. And that's why you want a statistically significant sample here, so when you come back and you get a statistically significant sample, you can tell the difference. And that becomes essentially like growing potatoes. And we think it's a property right concept as well, which
But
makes
that
it very
third
different.
party, would just be any lab, or is it under?
We
the
will be setting up something. We've incorporated a nonprofit called the Texas Coastal Exchange. That nonprofit will be basically mediating all of this process, and we'll be setting up all of this. We're going to have a buyers club and a sellers club, and the ranchers will be part of the sellers club. And we're looking to create a partnership, possibly with the Savory Institute, possibly with some of the other agricultural, so that ranchers can actually get a lot of help in management techniques on how to do this. I mean, you can just put a bunch of cows out and let them graze, but there's actually some techniques that can be used that can really make this work much better. And there'll be a lot of help and assistance on that. But ultimately, the entity, the Texas Coastal Exchange, will be buying the carbon from the ranchers and then selling the carbon to the buyers, and will put themselves in the middle, because most of the buyers have told us they have no interest in actually negotiating with the sellers directly. And certainly don't want any of the legal enforcement requirement, because there's going to be, I mean, these are commodities contracts basically, and so they would like to have as little. We want to make it as simple for everybody as we can. We probably won't, but we're going to try. Okay, back in the back again. I see your hand.
So that's again, if you have a ranch but you have a company, chemical company or something, so could the company ever approach the rancher? Or?
Yeah, the chemical company could approach the rancher, but they wouldn't have the certification.
Yes. They
They wouldn't necessarily have the certification of having met the standards of the Texas Coastal Exchange, and at least in theory, that should have some value. Right now, it's got Rice's name behind it. That's of some value. If we can get a major non-governmental organization to endorse it, that may have some value. If we get a number of other participants, it begins to have a bit of a life of itself. We're making arrangements with institutes. We're making arrangements with others. So that becomes a bit of an imprimatur. Ultimately, a rancher can sell whatever they want to sell to anybody that will buy it. We think the market will be there, but this offers, well, I skipped a step. You also have to register all of this. Okay. Because you as a rancher might sell John some carbon, and you might sell me the same carbon. Mm-hmm. How do you keep track of that carbon? So you're going to need a registry, and you're going to have a meets and bounds description of the property that's enrolled, and each one of those has a unique lot number. So that's the kind of the guarantee that you won't be double and triple selling the same carbon. And so you will basically, it's like getting a stock certificate, except it's a carbon certificate.
We got time for one more question.
One more question.
I'm wondering if the price of each of your books includes a carbon offset.
We have one other question,
You know, that's a great question, and I will take it up with Texas A&M Press, but I bet you can assume that it does not. But now I will offer an option to you. You can pay me $5 extra, and I'll take care of it.
We've got a little something for you. Appreciate you coming this evening.
Oh, thank you.
The Audubon Society.
Well, sure. A little card in there, and what have I gotten? Book. The back roads of Texas. I will be able to find all the ranches I'm going to be finding. Thank you very much.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, that concludes
concludes tonight's speaker event. I appreciate you all coming. It's a great turnout. I hope to all see you again in the future. Jim, thank you again.
Oh, you bet. Thank you so much for having me. You bet.